This is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. I'm super excited to have with me two powerhouse sisters today, people I've known in different contexts. One is Josephine Gon, Jo Gon, who is the Jewish Community Relations Council Director at the Federation of Palm Beach, and also has another title. You'll give your entire bio, Jo. And then Sara Gon, who is with the Institute of Race Relations in South Africa and with High FM Radio. And I thought it would be interesting to bring these two on because they're both involved in the worlds of political advocacy. They both grew up in South Africa, and I'm fascinated by what's going on in South Africa. I'm obviously fascinated by what's going on in the U.S., the ideological environment. And I thought it would be good to sort of have a discussion about some of these issues that face both countries and face the Jewish communities in both places. And so, Sara, maybe I thought I'd start with you. Obviously, we had the court case. In addition to whatever travesty of justice that was, it must have been very hard for the Jewish community in South Africa. Can you tell us about the feelings of people in South Africa, how they regarded that moment and are regarding it?
The Jewish community, which is only 45,000 strong, were, on the one hand, disappointed, relieved that the court didn't go so far as to actually impose a ceasefire or try to, but it was the fact that there was no doubting the rightness of Israel's position. It was just the fact that one knew that anything that could be perceived as a win by the government would be propaganda. That was for them the win, was to get something in their favor from the International Court of Justice. It almost doesn't matter what happens from here. But so an angry, upset and besieged South African community just felt that this was partly, par for the course. I suppose that there has to be an understanding that the ANC's weddedness to Hamas and to the PA, etc., is a sort of partly romantic thing that goes to the idea of liberation movements. In other words, you support liberation movements, whatever the merits may be. The ANC at some point in the 60s actually trained under these Germans and the Soviets with the PLO and the IRA. So it's a sort of pickled in aspic response to geopolitics and what is good for the country. And basically we've reached a point where for the ANC government, what's good for the country is not good for them, so we get what's not good for them.
There are 45,000 Jews left in South Africa. What has been the population decline? What was it at its height? How many of those people have left in the last, let's say, decade?
Yeah. At its height, it was probably about around between 150 and 175,000 people. So it was never a huge population, but the drop has been sort of consistent from the years, the declaration of the Republic in 1960 through the height of apartheid. And I think, you saw, as I say, a gradual concern of insecurity over the decades. And then in the last 2 decades, as ANC rule has become really decrepit, for want of a better word, the pace has picked up. And so we were sort of sitting in the 60 to 75,000, and probably in the last decade and less, you've seen the decline down to about 45,000. And I think it's just a sense of, we're quite a sort of battle-hardy community. It's a small, and compared to much in the rest of the world for a diaspora community, it's predominantly Orthodox rather than Reform. And it has its origins in predominantly Lithuania and the other Baltic states, very much a product of the Russian pogroms of the late 19th century, etc. So it has a very distinct and a very strongly Zionist bent, and it has always been proportionately seen to be a Jewish population that has been extraordinarily supportive within its limitations, but extraordinarily supportive of Israel.
Yes, I've seen that. I've also been to Australia where I saw a lot of South African Jews who had almost taken over the Australian Jewish community. They had fled South Africa, were very good organizers, and seemed to outshine many of their Australian friends, and were heading up these institutions. Joe, what's it been like for you watching what's happening in South Africa? First of all, what year did you leave, and how long have you been in the States?
So I left in 1990. So I've been out of the country. This is my 34th year, which is astonishing, which means I've lived out of the country longer than I lived in it. But it's still my home and it's still where my family is. So, I'm still very connected to South Africa, and I watch its decline with great, great, great dismay. And there's always been, when it comes to Israel, this issue, the culmination of the ANC taking Israel to the International Court is not the first we encounter with it. It's the whole apartheid accusation against Israel, apartheid. So, somehow there's this tie into so much of the anti-Israel vitriol has somehow connected to South Africa, because of course we know what apartheid is and we know what apartheid isn't. And we know that Israel is no such thing. But it's weird, it's strange, I guess, that South Africa is so intricately tied in with the haters, the anti-Israel movement.
Yeah, I suppose it was no accident that the Durban conference I think it was 2001, not long after 9/11 here, was something that took place in South Africa itself. There were other ideological forces afoot there, but it was on South African soil where that conference, in which Israel and Jews were really targeted, took place, and was a wake-up call, I think, for global Jewry that we had troubles.
And the head of the UN commission that's predetermined to find Israel as an apartheid state is Navi Pillay, who is a South African as well. So unfortunately, it's all over the place.
So, Sarah, you were talking about this sort of revolutionary fervor that's been part of the anti-South Africa apartheid experience and woven into the country's history and politics. We're seeing some of that on US soil these days. And I'm wondering, Joe, I mean, you're from South Africa. You grew up with that fervor. To what degree have you been on alert to some of these same themes on the US front by virtue of your experience growing up in South Africa?
I guess it's part of this love affair with these liberationists I'm very aware of. I think there's also a tendency, I don't know if it's an American thing. I think there's this general, there's a love affair with the Arab world. You see it in especially the English. I think Sara and I both referred to it, I don't know where it came from, but the Lawrence of Arabia effect. That there's this romanticization of the Levant and the scarves and the eyes and the horses and whatever. So I think that's always existed. And it's amusing as it is, I think there's some truth to it. And I think this tendency to favor the Arab world over anybody else who happens to live there. And I think it's infected the whole movement. I mean, I think there's something about this because it's tied in with the ideology of the victim oppressor narrative. So liberationist groups are all about, the rights of the oppressed. So it's a natural partnership there.
Yeah, but your own experience growing up in South Africa, do you think that put you on high alert for the same trends in the US? Did that affect your own consciousness of this problem?
It's an interesting question. It's hard to divorce one's experience, everything that goes to make up who I am and why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's my generation, it's my Zionist background, it's the fact that we're from a family with which a large portion of it was murdered in the Holocaust. growing up in apartheid South Africa with so many segregations, not just racial, but between and amongst white groups, and whether you were Jewish or not. I mean, there's so many levels of strata. So that is who I am, and I am the consequence and the result. I grew up deeply believing that if Jews don't look after one another, no one will. That was my message to my family's background, how I was brought up. Sorry, maybe it's different, but I suspect the same. So it all goes to form who I am. And I guess I've never thought of it that way. Maybe there is something there that makes me more alert to it. Certainly, I will say, as a foreigner and an immigrant to this country and not a native-born American, I have a very different worldview to foreign policy, to what the rest of the world actually looks like, to the naivety, I call it, about American foreign policy and worldview. I don't have that. And I see it around me. I had a conversation about this with a colleague just yesterday, in response to a statement that everyone just wants everything. We all want the same things as human beings. And, I don't have that. I struggle with the American worldview sometimes. So I think it's all of this.
Yeah. I asked that question because I've obviously gotten to know a lot of Jews from the former Soviet Union, Persian Jews, and they almost inevitably wince at any smack of ideology that reminds them of where they came from. Particularly Jews from the former Soviet Union, when they see some of the radical social justice ideology in our society, alarm bells go off because it reminds them of what they were taught in the former Soviet Union. Now, I know that the South African Jewish experience is not the same as the Soviet experience, but those ideological tropes must be deeply embedded. And I wondered, Sarah, you were going to say something. I want to come back to this idea of what that American worldview is and how you define yourself differently. But Sarah, you were going to say something.
I just wanted to sort of give a little background, because one has to bear in mind, of course, that because they're like in much of the New World, there were a fair number of Jews involved in the anti-apartheid struggle at various levels, significant in the writing of the Freedom Charter, which is to a large extent be considered our sort of bedrock document, even though it's a little bit, sort of 1950s. 5 of the co-accused that stood with Nelson Mandela in the dock were Jewish. His lawyers were Jewish, and he had in fact been employed as an articled clerk in a law firm by a Jewish law firm when it was, essentially forbidden by the party regime. So a bit like the parallel of the relationship between Jewish America and Black America and the civil rights struggle. There was, I think, a recognition of each other's struggle and victimhood. But what essentially changed is that once the Mandela era was over, the pure sort of pretty shallow but dogged ideology of the left in the classic sense, the sort of thing you're seeing on campuses in America, really was what started to come out of the ANC. Very much, the victimhood, the liberation movements, seeing Palestinians as not white and all Jews as white, generally a sort of, as I say, shallow and pretty much to a lot of ignorance. So we're basically living with a generation that has also, laid economic waste to this country. So we've just had the State of our Nation address yesterday, and it was, it gets more farcical every year. Cyril Ramaphosa stands up, pardon the Freudian slip, and he says, these are the great things we did. And in the first decade of ANC rule, some considerable achievements were made, and we gave the ANC credit for it. And then once this sort of smiling, charming warlord of Jacob Zuma became president in 2009, corruption, kleptocracy, cadre deployment, all of those wonderful things took over and sent us down into a spiral at the time when the world was recovering from 2008 and the economic crisis. We literally went in the opposite direction. And it was very much, I suppose, the result of a movement that had to the extent that it had a moral compass, that compass had long sort of zigzagged out of view, and a lot of the intellectual heft that was in the ANC had disappeared. So our ministers are largely considered figures almost of fun at the moment, and for them Israel would have been an ideological thing, but would have been very much a burnishing of very poor credentials, reburnishing them, getting them back onto the world stage, since we had disappeared and our importance, our sort of fighting above our weight had gone. So they're very much sort of living in the moment. And, you know, I have a certain faith that the ANC will experience a Pyrrhic victory sooner rather than later in all of this.
Yeah.
I wanted to just say, David, that when you talk about the Russians and the Iranians having, you know, the tenterhooks go, for me, it's more about the race thing. And when I hear the race essentialism arguments, whether it's how it DI or whatever's happened now, that to me, it's like, that's apartheid. I say often that the founders of apartheid would be smiling that people are being now categorized and identified essentially by their race. That I have tenterhooks, you know, radar for.
Right. I want to go back to what, go ahead, Sarah. Sorry.
Just in response to that, it is, and it's. I remember watching a couple of years ago an interview with James Lindsay, and he said then, and it was the first time I'd heard it, it may have not been the first time it was said, that the natural consequence of DEI, of race essentialism, anti-racism, was genocide. And, you know, I think frankly, the success of the Jews in surviving and going beyond survival, getting beyond their victimhood, we haven't determined our futures by our past. It's informed our futures, but it's not determined our futures. So we've not become bogged down. We've become very successful. That's the envy's huge, I think.
Yeah, well, anti-Semitism is, you could argue, largely driven by envy, and conspiracy theories that are probably given fuel through envy. So, Joe, you were saying that this idea that we're all the same, that everybody wants the same things, maybe that would that is not born out of your experience growing up, and that you sort of wince when you hear it. Talk a little bit more about that. What do you hear, and what are the kinds of things that you react to?
Well, you look, I mean, one sees it all the time in America, and I think it guides our foreign policy. It's this tendency, maybe it's a Western thing, I'm talking about from an American perspective, is this tendency to, you know, it's what, you know, let's be nice. It's not being hard and powerful. There's something about America more recently that doesn't want to embrace its power, which is very strange for the world power. This idea that we are all the same and all want the same things in life, which is, you know, maybe by and large true, and maybe Americans feel this way, but there's a lack of appreciation of different cultures and different worldviews and different societies, partly because people haven't experienced them, maybe they're not traveled enough, but it informs foreign policy very often, and that, you know, we know regions of the world are functions of power and respectful power, and there's, you know, this inability to negotiate powerfully, to understand the world we're dealing with, to really understand who the mullahs are and what Russia is. And there's this, it's a very American worldview. I don't know how else to put it other than to say, it's also this unwillingness to not believe what people are saying when they're saying it, whether it's in English, Arabic, Russian, whatever. And it's like, you know, they're saying they want to kill you, and Americans say, well, you know, we wouldn't do that, so they wouldn't do it. You know, I'm obviously oversimplifying here, but I do see that. I see it in a tendency. I see it in conversations I have.
David, can I add to that? It's
Sure.
my view, I would put it exactly in this way. It's a failure to understand that cultural paradigms differ. The West is very much a culture of guilt, very much it's Christian history. The Middle East is an honor shame culture, but it's not the only honor shame culture. It's very much a feature of tribal societies. So it's something that's gone, it's something that has existed to a greater or less extent across towards the East as far as Japan, and it just how it manifests itself, how that shame, the honor is regained from shame, which is completely foreign to Western minds. It could be killing the other, it could be committing suicide, it could be a range of other things. It's not that unusual, but from a Western paradigm, it is chalk and cheese. And I suppose it's very much looking at it from the outside, the Biden administration's appeasement of Iran in that context of understanding those paradigms just makes no sense. I mean, it's like a switch that says, "Hey guys, we can go." They're on, they're exhibiting weakness.
Right. Yes. Unfortunately, people who believe that the Iranians are capable of changing have won the day in this administration, and I'm not sure there's any sign of change. It seems to me that this idea of culture, which I think anybody who's lived in another culture understands, is a paramount factor to why certain groups engage in the way they do, that show up in the way that they do, and others engage differently or think differently or behave differently. That's being banished from our discourse in many ways. It's the sort of root cause of the current ideological moment. This is me opining, and that people want to banish the cultural discussion because it's dangerous, by the way, and it is dangerous. It can be weaponized in ways that are demeaning to another culture. Oh, your culture is inferior or something like that. But yet, at the same time, you can't ignore that culture is real and that cultures do explain group behavior and group dynamics, or there wouldn't be any difference in culture. And we're in this strange dynamic where we're not allowed to talk about it. I want to end with a question. Sarah, do you believe that there's a future for South African Jews?
I think, it is a very, very small minority, but in a way it's a reflection of Jewry worldwide. I mean, we're on, the classic 0.1% of the South African population. I think, I can't say life is going to get more pleasant, but I think finally, the rest of the world has kind of joined us, and we're all in it together. And because we've been a community that's had to sort of fight for our corner, years of Israel apartheid week on campuses, and watching these poor, lovely young Jewish kids have to sort of find a way and tactics to deal with this, and sometimes very ingeniously. I think the also there are two advantages of two of the many strange advantages of living in South Africa despite our economy. The one is the weather. Sorry, it is the weather, and that is big. And the other is that we are surrounded by and adapt to cultural differences. But what we also learn is that there are things that people from different cultures do want. They want secure lives for their families. They want the potential to grow. They want the potential to succeed. I don't say all cultures are like that, but South Africans are also hell of nice people.
Right. I had to laugh. It seems like you're saying, well, we're catching up elsewhere. It means that we're becoming as dysfunctional as South Africa is in our politics, and therefore, where are you going to flee to? Israel? Well, they have their problems. The United States? Well, we have our problems.
Exactly. I would add, though, that I was reading an article about the rising rates of anti-Semitism in South Africa, and the minister of whatever was denying that this was the truth. But I had to smile because, well, we've got the same statistics here. Everywhere it's rising, so,
right.
But can I add from a South African perspective, what's interesting about that is that what we forget is that we are an 80% Christian country, and conservative as a result. And we have a lot of the population that either knows very little, if anything, about Israel, or is very supportive from a biblical point of view. So in reality, despite all the noise and the pain and the sheer aggravation and the sort of wrist slitting that you want to indulge in, the government and the left are the minority. It's just that they're in power. If please God, the government were to change in the next election in a few months' time, there would, I think, foreign affairs, for example, would do a 180-degree turn. I think would pivot to the West so quickly, it would make everyone's head spin.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, and you're both so well spoken and thoughtful. So to be continued.
Okay, thanks,
All right.
David.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.